Hello, welcome to my PowerPoint presentation on inductive reasoning. With induction, you're not going to have all the evidence, so you try to make the most logical conclusion based on the evidence that you have. Generally, that's how logic works. You're looking for the most likely scenario based on the evidence that you have, and if you get new information, well, you might just change your thesis. So, because you're not dealing with all the evidence, the main thing is you don't want to reach a hasty generalization, or you want to make sure you gather enough evidence and the right type of evidence to reach a logical conclusion. So that jump is called an inductive leap. For example, if I ask you what color a polar bear is, most of you will say a polar bear is white. Have you seen all polar bears? No. But the ones you've seen, whether it be on the internet, the Coca-Cola bear, or wherever else, perhaps the zoo, are white. Therefore, you make the leap that polar bears are white. That's how inductive reasoning works. The two Q's, quantity and quality, are important when you're looking at inductive reasoning. Make sure you have enough evidence and make sure it is sophisticated evidence. So when I have you do a research paper, I'm going to ask for 5, 8, 10 sources. Why do I do that? Well, I want to make sure that you have enough evidence to reach a logical conclusion. Also, I'm going to ask you to find quality sources, Harvard, Yale, those types of studies, rather than just Crazy Carl the blogger, we'll call him. Because otherwise, your opposition is going to have enough sources, and they're going to have quality sources, and that's going to make it difficult for your argument. So when you're thinking of induction, the more information you have and the better quality information you have, the more likely you are to reach a logical conclusion. One way of looking at this is to ask yourself, is my sample known? Is it sufficient? And is it representative? So I'll start with, is the sample known? Does this sample lack evidence? Oftentimes you see 4 to 5 doctors say this, 4 to 5 dentists say that, so forth and so on. If you can verify where that research was done, how it was conducted, and so forth, then you can reach a logical conclusion. Quite often, unfortunately, that isn't the case, or it's lost in some small font down below on the screen where you could never really verify it, so you have to withhold judgment. You can't know for certain. Next on the list, you see UFOs. Well, ancient alien theorists generally believe in this benevolent alien who came here years ago and spliced its intelligent DNA with the Neanderthal man, creating the human being as we know it today. And that benevolent alien maybe helped us create the pyramids, gave us other technological advances. Hence, we're at now, where you're watching me on YouTube, for example. However, when you ask them for evidence that UFOs came, it gets a little questionable. They'll look at any biblical story, Hindu stories, Greek and Roman mythology. Those weren't aliens, those were gods. Those weren't angels, those were actually all aliens. So the angels, the gods, all those of the past were actually aliens. And, the ancient man didn't understand how to interpret it, so they decided to call them gods rather than aliens. But the bottom line is that isn't really information, any sort of evidence that we could, hold to scientifically. We'd want to see the alien carcass. We'd want to see the actual fossilized information, the wreckage, so forth and so on. Of course, that's always hidden from us. The government has it, but they're not letting us see it. Well, we can't reach a logical conclusion based on stuff we can't hold on to. What we do know from science is, first of all, if you listen to some of our greater scientific minds, Stephen Hawking, before he passed away, for example, he might suggest you don't want an alien here because it's probably not benevolent, and if it's intelligent enough to make it here, it probably would turn out to be a very bad thing for humans. So there's that. There's also the amount of distance it would take to get here, the amount of time it would take to get here, the type of technological advancements it would take to get here, that all make it highly unlikely. And as far as those pyramids go, as far as skyscrapers go, cell phones go, so forth and so on, you're essentially saying that humans just aren't smart enough to do any of that stuff, therefore aliens had to help us, which, again, isn't necessarily true. So with UFOs, we have to withhold judgment. Maybe they exist, maybe they don't exist. The evidence seems to suggest that, sure, with the billions of galaxies that are out there, there almost certainly would have to also be intelligent life out there. However, it doesn't mean that life actually made it to the planet Earth. Bigfoot, same problem. Maybe he's bouncing back and forth between parallel universes, but more likely than not, he is a legend that was made up. And these legends are found throughout cultures. So if you want to, study some Campbell and look at some archetypes and so forth, that is interesting stuff when it comes to all religion and philosophy and these stories and so forth, that the Yeti shows up in so many different cultures. But most likely he's a story that was handed down over the generations rather than an actual being, as we don't have the fossilized information and so forth as we do with dinosaurs and other things to prove the existence. Atlantis, again, very likely there is an ideology in place. There is a story of an advanced culture that had pottery, maybe weapons, arts, and so forth that were advanced. Maybe a tsunami or something wiped it out. All that makes sense to come up with the idea of an Atlantis, but an actual advanced civilization with magical crystals and so forth, or a civilization that was even more advanced than we are, doesn't seem as likely. So with all those things, maybe they exist, maybe they don't exist, we don't have any actual verifiable evidence to show that they exist, therefore we withhold judgment. So make sure you have a sample. A lot of hearsay and so forth that we go through in life is based on these sort of hasty generalizations where we don't actually have any evidence. Have evidence. So do research before you try to reach any conclusions. That would be the best bet. Make sure you have enough of it. You can go through the list that's on there, but anytime you don't have enough of it, you're going to, if you don't have enough of a sample, you're going to reach a hasty generalization and probably something that's stereotypical and doesn't, really capture the truth. Your average NFL player is a criminal. Your typical politician is a crook. They're both prominent. They're both in the news. So if an NFL player or a politician breaks the law, you're going to see them. That doesn't mean they represent all of them. So it isn't really enough of a sample. So don't just go to one source when you're doing your research papers. Go to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or more sources. The more you go to, the better off you probably will be in the long run. Is it representative? There's different ways of looking at representation. The first one I'm looking at is essentially based loosely off of a paper I read once talking about competitive sports and how they're not good for kids. And it went through some of, the important things like injuries and concussions and all of that. But then it went to the parents and it went to the coaches. And one of the reasons that was brought up would be considered something that isn't really representative of all coaches. She brought in a coach from a little league team that took the opposing team's jersey, lit it on fire, and then said, essentially, see, I told you coaches are out of control. But that is an atypical coach. He does not represent all coaches. And you can't say, well, all coaches are out of control because of this one coach that did go over the line. So a lot of times our politicians would love to take all of our rights away from us because of one unrepresentative sample. But make sure it's a typical sample. When you bring in evidence, when you bring in an anecdote or some sort of a story, an illustration, make sure it's typical of the whole class of things you're studying. Otherwise, your opposition is going to come in and say it's atypical, therefore it's not going to hold up as well logically. Representation can also go into statistics. Isolating statistics is one way of doing that. The way they word polling questions certainly is something to consider. I know in Kentucky, when they asked Kentuckians what they thought of Obamacare, man, they didn't like Obamacare. But when they asked Kentuckians how they liked their new exchange system for medical coverage, man, they loved their exchange system for medical coverage. Well, Obamacare provided that exchange system, which of course did lower premiums and add access for more people to have health insurance. But the word Obama, in some areas, automatically made people think, I don't like it. And you see that sort of thing, and how do you feel about helping out the poor? I like helping out the poor. What do you think about welfare? I hate welfare. Well, welfare is a system, granted. Some people have questions about how it is used, but it is a system put in place to help those in poverty, aka assisting the poor. So how you word a question can certainly have an effect on groups. When you look at a poll on any of the stations, I'll pick on Fox News. You're looking at Fox News and they say, well, 70% of our viewers, 80% of our viewers say this, that, or the other thing. For this one, it's saying, that they think universal health coverage or that public option is a terrible thing. Well, if they're watching Fox News, they're conservative and they're already into a for-profit sort of medical coverage system, which is what we have now. So of course they're probably going to pull that way. But if you look at everyone and you pull across party lines and independents and so forth, you're going to see that the majority of people in this country actually would like to have what all the other democracies on the planet have, some sort of Medicare for all that drives down costs. So again, with polling, how do you do it? Well, the Gallup poll used to be the thing, and I'm older, so I recall the landline, and I recall when you had a call, you picked it up, and you didn't know who was calling, and they might ask you a couple questions quickly, and you answered them, and you hung up, because we didn't have caller ID and so forth. So it's a little more difficult to get polling down nowadays, because we all have caller ID, we can see who's calling, we might ignore the call, so forth and so on. But when they do the random polls of 1,000 people or so, it's usually within 3 to 6% of the variance. It's close to right, but not absolute, and it's become more difficult to do this type of polling for sure. But that's the only way you can really know. Any sort of selective sample, like the one I mentioned before with Fox News, is likely to be skewed. Anytime you're just going to online sites where other people haven't been there, it's going to be skewed as well. So you can't know for certain with that type of polling, because you can't represent those who didn't go to the page or went to the page but didn't bother to answer the survey, so forth and so on. This one is a classic one. Women must be better drivers, right? They have less accidents. Well, you can't just go on accidents in that way. You have to look at the totality of the picture. Men, women, people who have had accidents, people or drivers who have had no accidents. When you do that, you're going to find that there are fewer women in accidents. However, it's not necessarily just because they're better drivers. It is because less of them are on the road at any given moment. So pure numbers alone show, yes, more men will be in accidents, but that's simply because, statistically speaking, there's more of them behind the wheel at any given moment. So, of course, they're more likely to have an accident. So representation means looking at everything. Pictures, well, we live in the age of the internet. They can doctor a picture in any way, shape, or form, so photographic evidence is probably questionable. A lot of this goes back to Occam's razor. You've probably seen this on some crime shows and so forth. Occam's razor, the detective will come in. He wants to use Occam's razor. Basically, that simplest answer is going to be the best answer. So if you have that body of evidence, go to the simplest answer first. It's not always right, but it's most likely right. It's like 90-some% of the time right. So try there first, and then go into the more obscure things if you can't find the right answer there. So if you have the motive, opportunity, and the gun, you're likely guilty. A lot of times these conspiracy theories are going to point to evidence we can't touch, like with the shadowy figure with Harvey Oswald, or we can't put our fingers on it, or the government's hiding it from us, or somebody else is hiding it from us. We can't make logical conclusions based off of that. I'm not going to tell you that every single conspiracy theory that ever exists is just nonsense. I'm just going to tell you, when we're looking at logic, we don't make any conclusion until we have evidence in front of us that we can actually measure and touch. So from Occam's razor's standpoint, you're not going to make that conclusion. So let's go to the crop circles. With the crop circles, you can reach one of two conclusions. You can decide that aliens have landed and left a mark on the ground with these patterns and so forth from their spaceships. Or you could decide that college students decided to play a hoax and create these things, as a prank and kind of for some fun. Well, the reason I'm going to go with college students and the prank is because I know college students do exist and they do pull pranks. Oh yeah, and also they kind of came forward and admitted to the hoax. But that aside, it's still the most logical answer because we don't have any evidence that alien spacecraft or anything else exists outside of our imagination. So we're going to go with the one that makes the most sense. That concludes my slideshow on inductive reasoning. I hope you have enjoyed this.